Hello and happy Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. I'm Congressmember Judy Chiu, and as the chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, or what we call CAPAC, I want to thank the Asian Hall of Fame for hosting this incredibly important hate crime policy forum. Discussions like today's, which help educate and mobilize our community, are exactly why the Asian Hall of Fame plays such an important role in our community and why I am proud to join with you. And the conversation could not be coming at a more important time. In March, our nation was shocked and horrified by the murder of 8 people in Georgia, including 6 Asian women. In response, I organized a congressional delegation to Atlanta to meet with the victims' families as well as local AAPI community leaders. And we went there with a purpose to follow the murderer's steps to show how deliberate he was in targeting 3 Asian-owned spas. Starting at the site of the first shooting, named Young's Asian Massage, we then drove 27 miles, as the shooter did, until we arrived at 2 more Asian spas that were across the street from each other, where he continued his murderous spree. Local sheriffs have tried to diminish these crimes by saying the shooter had a sex addiction and a bad day. But he had plenty of other places to go to in those 27 miles. Instead, he chose 3 places where there would be no doubt that Asian women would be killed, and there is no doubt in my mind that these shootings were a hate crime. And I've written a letter to the Department of Justice urging them to investigate it as such. Nothing could be more deliberate and intentional. The shooter's actions shouted hate when he targeted these locations. He viewed the victims as nothing more than their race, but we know they were so much more. In fact, in Georgia, we met with 2 of the victims' families who, through their tears, told us their loved ones' stories. These were hard-working daughters, mothers, and grandmothers, some in their 50s, 60s, and as old as 74, who were simply trying to support their families. But sadly, while these shootings were shocking, they were not a surprise to many of us in the Asian American community. Since the start of the coronavirus pandemic, there have been over 6,600 reported anti-Asian hate crimes and incidents, which increased with Donald Trump's usage of the terms China virus, Wuhan virus, and Kung flu, fanning the flames of xenophobia. And it's only gotten worse in recent months, with attacks becoming almost daily tragedies, leading many AAPIs to wonder, will I be next? This is why we in the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, or CAPAC, have been taking actions for over a year with press conferences, statements, hearings, and legislation. And fortunately, we've already gotten help from an important partner, and that is President Biden. Within his first week in office, President Biden issued a presidential memorandum to address anti-Asian hate, instructing the Department of Justice to work with the AAPI community in finding solutions to combating hate crimes and incidents. And just last month, the president invited me and other AAPI members of Congress to join him in the White House to discuss additional ways that we can work together to address anti-Asian hate and keep our communities safe. One thing we discussed in that meeting was the need to strengthen existing hate crime laws and ensure that federal, state, and local officials have the resources they need to investigate and prosecute hate crimes. And just last month, we took a major step forward when the Senate voted on Senator Mazie Hirono and Representative Grace Meng's COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act. This bill would help improve our hate crimes response by creating a new position at the Department of Justice to help improve hate crimes reporting. And it also includes the text of my bill, the No Hate Act, which will provide resources to law enforcement to improve hate crimes reporting, tracking, and enforcement. This legislation passed in the Senate with overwhelming votes of 94-1, an almost unheard of show of bipartisan support these days, and it shows that AAPIs are not alone. The next step is a vote in the House this month before we send the bill to the President Biden's desk. And I know that once it's signed into law, these laws will help us better understand and respond to the problem of anti-Asian hate crimes. In the meanwhile, we can do our part by encouraging anyone we know who's a victim of a hate crime or incident to report. We can take bystander intervention training, and we can continue to speak out like you are doing today. So thank you again for hosting today's discussion and for all you are doing to address hate crimes and keep our communities safe.
What do you think are some of the platforms and programs or other solutions that you feel would address and solve the issue of hate in America right now? Mm-hmm. I'm going to start with Congressman Lieu.
Let me first start off by thanking the Asian Hall of Fame for inviting me, and I'm so honored to be on here with all the distinguished panelists. In response to your question, well, first of all, it's helpful to do events like this to recognize Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and also to discuss specifically the issue of hate and hate incidents and hate crimes. I also want to let everyone think about how important each of you are. Understand your power to help shape public sentiment. So for anyone who is watching, for example, social media is free. So if you write an interesting post, maybe you'll affect someone in Florida or in Ohio or in Oregon. Think about writing letters to the editor. It's true that many newspapers get letters to the editor. It's also true many of them come from the same people. So when you start writing in, eventually you'll get published and you can start changing hearts and minds. And then considering showing up in rallies, in marches, or volunteering on campaigns, whether it's for an issue or a candidate or a movement. Understand your power to shape public sentiment. And I think Abraham Lincoln had it right when he said, public sentiment is everything. With it, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed.
First of all, I also just want to thank Karen Wong and the foundation for having this forum and for including the judicial branch in this whole discussion. Sometimes we're left out, and yet we're the ones who, if you will, provide the forum for resolving some of these cases and matters. You know, I think it's really important that the audience really understand that there really isn't one single solution to resolving hate in America. It's been with us through our lifetime in history. We need to consciously work to eradicate white supremacy and to address these questions and issues. But people need to know they need to address this, as the Congressman mentioned, in a variety of different ways. And wherever you are, right, in your churches, in your schools, in your communities, the more that we in the API community also tell our stories is very important in terms of raising awareness and giving people permission to talk about this. We too, right, share in the whole notion that this country is better than where we have been recently, that we actually can reach for that place where equality and fairness is truly something that can be realized. And I know our judges and courts around the country are working very, very hard to also provide a fair forum. So when these cases come to our courtrooms, right, we are outfitted and ready to provide a dignified environment for these cases to proceed. So I think, again, it's a multifaceted approach and not just a single bullet, if you will.
First, also, of course, appreciate everyone being part of this important conversation. And let me just say that, you know, I think for the rest of the country, Atlanta was a wake-up call of what all of us on this call from the Asian American community has known has been happening, not just since the beginning of this pandemic, but really throughout our country's history. And I think it's significant that we are gathered from across the country representing different levels and branches of government and community because to address anti-Asian hate is going to take a comprehensive, systematic, deep approach at every level of government, with all branches of government, with every sector in every part of the country. We need leadership, as Congressman Lieu put it, all pushing together. And to say that there's a silver bullet to address the recorded 6,600 incidents of hate in this past year, which is likely just the tip of the iceberg of what's happening, would obviously, I think, be minimizing the conversation. I'll just mention briefly that I am part of the Asian caucus in the California State Legislature. And this past week, we put out a $200 million 3-year plan to address anti-Asian hate. And it has components like, how do we increase culturally sensitive, community-based patrols in our community? How do we ensure that we have a hotline that can do intake that then leads to appropriate investigations? How do we make sure that victims are being taken care of? Mental health concerns, culturally competent services, victim compensation. How do we think about this for the long term with education and ethnic studies and restorative justice programs? How do we think about language access equity and data equity, so we track what's happening in our community? I could talk for an hour on this, but I just want to give a sense of all the different parts of the picture. And I trust that we'll be probably talking about aspects of this over the next hour.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
Ms. Chung Joe, what's your take?
Yeah, I mean, to piggyback on what the other panelists have said, where I think they're talking about a lot of the policy ways in which we can support Asian victims of hate. I think on top of that, I would say, what can we as community members do? And we need to think about, how do we create our own safety in our own neighborhoods? We've seen programs like Compassion in Oakland that have had chaperoning services for Asian seniors in Chinatown. Advancing Justice, we offer bystander intervention trainings where people can learn, if you were to witness somebody being harassed on the street, what you could do to safely intervene to help de-escalate the situation. So I think there's both the policy aspect, which has been spoken to, already about. There are the community investment that all of us need to take that kind of ownership of. And I think what we need to do is, as a society, America needs to say that violence and racism has no place in this country. And we need to treat this not as an Asian American issue. It shouldn't just be Asians who care about this. We really need to say, America, we care about this. The way we did last year with people really galvanized by the Black Lives Matter movement to say anti-Blackness is not just a Black problem, it's an America problem. We need to do that today for the Asian community and say what's happening in our community is not just something that Asians need to care about and need to be worried about. It's something that our entire country, we need to eradicate this, and let's prioritize this as America.
Mr. Bannick, what's your take?
First, I just want to say thank you so much for having Yessenia and I at this amazing event. We are the hate crimes co-leads for the King County Prosecutor's Office. We currently don't have a hate crimes prosecutor position at the King County Prosecutor's Office. So Yessenia and I do this work in addition to our regular jobs because we're very passionate about hate crimes. We believe they deserve to be handled with special care, with special attention to the victims. A couple numbers I think that really stand out from what we've seen. You know, we file hate crime charges in King County because it is the most populous county in Washington State. You know, we file more hate crime charges than any other county in the state. In 2018, we filed 28 hate crimes. In 2019, we filed 39 hate crimes. And then last year in 2020, we filed 59 hate crimes, which is a gigantic increase, more hate crimes than we've ever filed as an office. And so I think it's really timely that this discussion is happening across our state and across the country, because we're seeing more hate crimes than we've ever seen. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. It could be that they're just being reported more. Some of these things have always been happening, but it's really important that we give them extra attention. Of those 59 cases that we filed last year in King County, almost all of the cases originated from the city of Seattle. And I think that's a really interesting statistic to look at when you talk about King County, because the city of Seattle is the only agency that we work with that has a bias hate crimes detective. And so what that means is the only agency, and again, we work with over 30 different law enforcement agencies in King County, and the one agency that has a dedicated officer to investigating hate crimes that is the agency that's producing the most hate crime cases. So what that tells us as prosecutors is we're probably missing a lot of hate incidents that happen in other parts of the county. We really think that it's necessary for each law enforcement agency to prioritize hate crimes and have a separate officer or have a separate unit dedicated to working up these cases. They're more complicated than other types of cases because we have to prove that racial, religious, or other kind of discriminatory motivation. And so it requires special attention from law enforcement. That takes resources, but it also just takes prioritization. And I think that's the most important thing in order to get all of these incidents and handle all of them with the special care that they need to be handled with.
And finally, Ms. Manzo, what's your take on this?
So I really like what a lot of panelists have said, specifically that it would be a multifaceted approach, any solution, that there's not really a solution. I think it's more of just a work that will be constant and difficult and ongoing, because we're dealing with a huge history in America of racism for a lot of communities. But the two things that I think stand out to me the most when I think about racial equity work is one, education, and two, system changes. And the panelists have talked about policy and community, but I would focusing on what you can do personally as well within any system that you work in or that you find yourself in. And so for education, I think it starts in general education. We as communities of color, as marginalized communities, are taken out of books in regular school education. And also education within our legal roles. I think we as prosecutors have a responsibility to educate ourselves as to what systems we are perpetuating that are inequitable. Education for law enforcement and education in our communities. I think a big part of underreporting, and I can only speak for myself and my community, for example, is fear of deportation. That's an example. So the mistrust with law enforcement and fear that if we report something, we might get deported. But I think there's a lot of work that we can do to build rapport with our communities to make them feel safe from those perceived consequences that they would not actually be actual consequences if they did report hate crimes. And the other part, when I talk about personal, I think as a Mexican immigrant in academic settings, this society is white centric from in so many aspects. It is white centric. So trying to work to identify what policies we have, anything that we're doing, the culture that we're in, how that's white centric, how that's minimizing voices of color. If for example, hiring practices, making sure that we're actually not just hiring people for their perceived representation so that we can have numbers of diverse people, but actually centering marginalized voices and actually hearing them and having them impact our decisions, our roles, what we write, what we do. And I really think that it's easy to look outward and blame others for maybe their ignorance, or they didn't have access to the education. They're not on our spectrum of awareness when it comes to racial equity. But I think it's harder to look inward and say, what are the systems that I'm perpetuating? Even if I'm a person of color, how am I perpetuating these racist systems? And what can I do to change that? And that takes work, and it takes vulnerability, and it takes risk. And honestly, I think if I'm not exhausted from the work in this area, then I'm not taking action. So I think it really, the other piece too, aside from policy and community work, is also just an internal lens.
Thank you all for your insight on that. That is a great first step. And we're going to move on now to the individual questioning, which I'll ask each of you a couple of questions. Start with Ms. Chung Joe. Why is it so important that we broaden this conversation to beyond just hate crimes and instead try to address the issue of hate incidents?
Well, as Assemblymember Chiu mentioned, there have been 66 reported incidents of hate since the pandemic began, according to Stop AAPI Hate. And what their report shows is that 90 to 95% of those are hate incidents that do not rise to the level of a hate crime. So only 5 to 10% have an element of a criminal activity that would be lead to an arrest or potential prosecution. Now, as also was mentioned, that's just the tip of the iceberg. Pew Research Center just put out a study where they surveyed Asian Americans that said 45% of the Asian Americans they surveyed stated that they had experienced some sort of incident that was motivated by their ethnicity or race since this pandemic began. 45%. So you consider there are 23 million or so Asian Pacific Islanders across this country, and we're talking about a huge number of these incidents happening. And it's important to recognize them both because even if something doesn't rise to the level of a crime, it is still incredibly traumatic to be called a racial slur, to be yelled at and told to go back to your country. I was speaking to one Asian victim who is a woman, and I will mention that Asian women have been targeted at 2 to 3 times the rate of Asian men. And she had been verbally harassed where a man was yelling at her and calling her the most awful names for 2 minutes. And she said, at that moment, I was scared for my life. Now, he did not do anything that warrants a criminal arrest in that situation, but it is still unbelievably scary to be yelled at and harassed. And at this moment, it's important to think about the totality of all hate, whether it's an incident or a crime, because the volume, the sheer volume is so high. And Asian Americans across this country are in such fear right now that I speak to many people who say, I will not leave my house. I tell my parents, I beg them not to take their daily walks because they're seniors and I don't want them hurt. And many Asians surveyed say, I'm more scared right now about fellow Americans from going out in the street and possibly being attacked than I am of this COVID virus that has killed hundreds and thousands of Americans in this country. So we need to think about just the sheer volume of these attacks, whether they are criminal or not, and what kind of an impact that has on our community.
Next question for you is, how does your organization and similar ones that are serving marginalized communities, how are they playing a role in reducing hate crimes and incidents in our communities? And at the same time, at a grassroots level, what can a community do to stop this violence?
Sure. So what a lot of API organizations like ours are doing is they're providing support directly on the ground to victims. So at Asian Americans Advancing Justice LA, we are the largest legal service and civil rights organization for the API community in the country. We have a helpline in 6 Asian languages and dialects, as well as English. So if somebody wants to call and report in their native tongue, they can. And for us, we're particularly worried about victims who might be more vulnerable to attack and have more barriers to accessing support. So that includes seniors, limited English proficient immigrants, and women. So we're on the ground providing services, and we're a trusted partner in a way that sometimes a government agency might not be.
We
Oh,
seem
Ms. Joe,
to
we seem to have lost her.
connection.
Yeah. Well, that was actually really interesting. I really wanted to hear it.
Very interesting.
Yeah, because she does a lot of work on the grassroots level, and that's, where a lot of the work is executed.
I'm so sorry. Can you hear me? I apologize.
That's all right.
I'm not sure where I was cut off. I would also add that we are working very closely with other communities of color and partners to create allyship, because at this moment, what we need to do is we need to have solidarity with others so we can effectively and efficiently respond to what's happening now, as well as when we know future incidents of hate will happen to other communities. And we want to show that kind of strong alliance in order to empower all communities of color.
Thank you very much. Moving on to Assemblymember Chiu. We're going to stay at the grassroots level here as far as our conversation goes. Speaking of, why is mandating a hotline in the state, down there in the state of California, a solution in the current environment? And at the same time, why has it been so difficult to get what seems like common sense legislation through down there in California on this?
Yeah, you would think this would have been done before, but it hasn't. So why to do it in the first place? I'm always of the perspective that if you don't track phenomenon, if you're not counting what's happening, things are not necessarily happening. And Connie mentioned the Stop AAPI hate effort, 3 Asian grassroots organizations that literally just started tracking, started counting. And at this moment, they have counted over 6,600 incidents of hate against our community. It's a mind-boggling, staggering number that is likely just an undercount of what's actually happening on the streets. And so many of us believe that it shouldn't be left up to a couple of grassroots organizations struggling mightily to do this. We should bring the imprimatur of government and state government to not only track what's happening, but ensure that victims are being taken care of properly, to ensure that cases, if they rise to the level of a hate crime, are being investigated and properly addressed. So we want to make sure that happens. What I can tell you about this bill is this is actually not the first time I've introduced it. I introduced it 4 years ago during the first year of the Trump administration. And I was asked to do it not by Asian American advocates, but by LGBTQ advocates who were seeing members of our LGBTQ community targeted. Our Muslim community, our Jewish community asked us to do this because they were seeing spikes, anti-Semitic incidents, anti-Muslim incidents, African-American hate crimes, Asian American hate crimes. So we tried to move it 4 years ago. But at the time, there wasn't the same type of urgency that we're seeing today about this. There wasn't the sense that it was something we needed to spend money on. So fast forward 4 years, I was literally asked to dust off the same proposal of setting up a hotline through our Attorney General's office. And that's where we're moving through the process, and fingers crossed.
With the Democrats have been in control, with a Democrat in control basically of the Attorney General's office down there for the past decade, really. Why does it require an act of legislation to get this hotline going?
Well, I think first and foremost, our laws are a reflection of our priorities. If we say we're going to do this, not only do we want our Attorney General to set up the office, we want our AG to work with a myriad of other state agencies, local agencies, and nonprofit and community partners to make sure that this information gets out. But it wasn't long ago that we had a Republican Attorney General. In fact, I will tell you, as a former prosecutor and a civil rights attorney, I may have brought some cases against former Republican administrations that were anti-immigrant. And we actually had, not long ago, Republican attorney generals who consistently took positions that were anti-immigrant, that were I think the direction that we wanted our API communities to move forward. And who knows how the pendulum swings, at the federal level, and Congressman Lieu knows this very well. It was just a couple months ago where we had a Republican attorney general and a Republican president who did not take this seriously, a Republican president who referred to the Chinese virus and Kung flu. And I know in Congress, I think today there's going to be a vote on a hate crime bill that, again, we all think on this call should have been done years ago, but this idea that at the federal level, we should coordinate the tracking of data throughout every state and every jurisdiction, a no-brainer to us, but we need to put this into law because, again, politics shift, politics changes. We don't know who's going to be in an office tomorrow, but we need to make sure that we've got protections for the future.
First off, Congressman, as we all know, right now, I believe Congress, it could be right now, is voting on that Senate bill that was passed last week for the anti-hate bill. What more can Congress and states do after this bill is signed by President Biden?
Thank you, Chris, for your question. Let me first thank Assemblymember David Chiu for his great work in California and on helping the AAPI community address hate crimes and hate incidents, and very pleased to see the additional funding as well. So the Senate has passed on bipartisan basis the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act. It's going to pass the House as well, also on a bipartisan basis. The bill does three main things. It requires that the Department of Justice expedite hate crimes related to COVID-19. It also does grants to states to provide better tracking and reporting of hate crimes, and also provides guidance to federal agencies and states on how to talk about hate crimes and hate incidents. I think it's a great first step. I also believe we have to change the federal standard for the federal hate crimes law. And as Prosecutor Bannick knows, the standard for hate crimes is really high. It's basically that race or gender or any other protected class has to be essentially the sole reason for the commission of the crime. I'm a former prosecutor, and not only is that standard very high, it also does not comport with reality. The reality is that defendants can commit crimes for multiple reasons. So Congresswoman Lucy McBath and I have introduced the Stop Hate Crimes Act, which would alter the federal standard to say that if race or gender or religion or any other protected class is a contributory motivating factor to the commission of a crime, then you can charge the hate crime. And the reason that this is important is you can have the FBI start investigating a lot more crimes that could be hate crimes if they simply had the jurisdiction to do it. One way to give them more jurisdiction is by changing the standard so that it's not such a restrictive high standard for people to meet. And it's also our view that race and any other protected class just shouldn't be any factor at all in any crime. And because it's a hate crimes issue, this is not going to result in, for example, any additional chance that an innocent person is going to be convicted because there's already an underlying crime. So if there was a murder or an assault, the person's already going to be charged with that. It's just that if race was involved, then there's an additional consequence. But because there is already this underlying crime, we think it's important to at least alter the standard so that if race is a contributing factor, then you should be able to charge a hate crimes violation. So hopefully we can get that through Congress as well.
You're a former state assembly member and state senator, and you're now serving in Congress. With that in mind, what do you think individual Congress members and state representatives can do to help reduce hate crimes in this country?
I think simply raising awareness is really important. Having served with 434 other members of Congress, it's very clear to me that a lot of members of Congress have districts that look nothing like mine in California. They have districts that have very few Asian Americans or Pacific Islanders. And the issue of hate crimes just isn't something that's in the top 50 issues that they think about on any given day. So simply having people talk about this and raise awareness is really important. And I think it's also important for people to understand why this is happening. It's not a coincidence that hate crimes against the Asian American community surged with the start of this pandemic. What we know is that in our nation's history, when America experiences fear, sometimes minority communities get scapegoated. So in the 1850s, we had the whole yellow peril hysteria. That was then followed by the Chinese massacre, which was the lynching of Chinese immigrants. That was followed by the Chinese Exclusion Act. And then in World War II, our own government interned over 100,000 Americans who happened to be of Japanese descent. In the 1980s, when America feared the economic rise of Japan, again, we saw additional hate crimes, including the murder of Vincent Chin. And then with this pandemic, we saw another surge. And as was said before, it certainly was not helpful that the former president used racist phrases like Kung Flu. So there is a history of this, and it's important to not only teach this history in our country, but also to make people very aware that this is not a coincidence that we're seeing hate crimes. It's a direct result of people who view us as somehow foreigners, that we're not of this country, that we're carrying this virus somehow, and we just have to directly attack those falsehoods.
We have a question from one of our press. Just to insert real quick is, okay, this is an interesting question. So regarding what Mr. Bannick said, if the answer is to create a separate unit, an officer that's focused on bias hate crimes, what can people do to make sure that this happens in every city in America? Is it funding? Is it petitions? What does it take to get a bias hate crime detective in every city?
I can take a stab at answering that. Not being a law enforcement officer working for an agency, I don't know exactly how these decisions are always made, but I know that funding is a factor. I know that right now in King County, there was a proposal by the King County Council to create that exact unit, a bias unit of detectives to investigate bias crimes and hate crimes. And that's something that's currently being proposed. I know also, though, that law enforcement agencies can choose to prioritize these things themselves by picking an officer, giving that officer training on hate crimes issues. That's one of the things Yessenia and I are attempting to help with. We conduct law enforcement trainings on hate crimes in King County. A lot of officers see things that are misdemeanor conduct, such as a road rage incident, a bar fight, something that is a typical type of misdemeanor crime, and they hear that a racial word is used, and they do not work that case up as a hate crime. If they don't work that case up as a hate crime, it never makes it to us as prosecutors. We often don't see it. We often don't hold that person accountable the way that they should. And so I think it's both. I think it's funding, and I think people should push for funding to their local, their council people, their legislatures. But I think people should also just push their law enforcement officers to make this a priority. It's actually something that most people all agree on, that this is a type of crime that we just need to bring to the top of the list as far as things that deserve priority. So I think it's, awareness, and it's raising awareness by giving pressure to the people that can make these decisions.
I got another follow-up text regarding that, which is, Maki, you said in the past that all it takes is for law enforcement officers to have a checkbox that says possible hate crime. Would that help deter crime? What do you think about that? I mean, I know none of us are law enforcement experts on this panel, but Mr. Bannick, do you think that even that little thing where you have a little checkbox that says possible hate crime would move it up the ladder?
I think it could help, and Yessenia might have some input here too, because Yessenia is the prosecutor who is often making that filing decision. So is actually reviewing these crimes as they come in. I think that could help. I don't think that would fix the problem entirely.
Right.
But any little thing we can do to remind officers to look into bias motive, I think is just a good thing. But do you have anything else on that, Yessenia?
I absolutely agree that it would not be a solution by any means, that there's so many other things that need to be done in addition to that. But when we, for example, as prosecutors, we receive something called a super form. That's when somebody gets arrested for a crime. It's a very short form. And one thing that is always on there is a domestic violence checkbox. So that alerts us to say, hey, this is a domestic violence case, and we can look at it in that lens. And I do think it would be incredibly helpful to have a hate crime checkbox. Because that would alert the officers, just as a standard, to have that at the forefront of their investigations, as opposed to something that they don't possibly even think about. So I do think that would be really helpful.
The sense of justice has evolved over time, and certainly Justice Lieu knows this well, right? It wasn't long ago where we didn't have domestic violence units in prosecutor offices. There weren't really domestic violence laws in the books. There weren't environmental protection units in prosecutorial offices. There weren't consumer units. And certainly this topic of hate crimes is a relatively new one. I don't think it's a coincidence that just in this past week, California, we have our first Filipino American Attorney General, and he just established a racial justice bureau, right? So it's a function of our perception of where justice changes. And I think that gets to sort of these questions of how does law enforcement, how do police, how do prosecutors look for evidence, are sensitized to the fact that if an Asian person is attacked on the streets, maybe it was a random act of violence, but it could have also been motivated by bias and by racism. And part of what we're trying to do is try to sensitize everyone to the fact that this all may be the case.
Love that. That's really great. I have a follow-up question for Assemblymember Chiu, which is really admire your work with hotlines. Would you consider QR codes?
Absolutely. We'll consider anything that helps to get the word out, that helps to foster investigations, that helps us to track and investigate. In fact, we're having those conversations right now, like what's the best way to meet people where they are. The challenge that I see with that is a lot of our immigrant communities who may be monolingual, may not have access to technology, they may not even know what that code is. All the language challenges that folks face, these are all challenges that we have to grapple with.
I love that. Yeah, and I have a very quick follow-up for Justice Lieu concerning the LGBTQ community. Asians are often targeted, but then marginalized by even our own community. You are such a role model regarding this issue. What do you feel the judicial system can do to give an assurance that voices are heard in this issue?
You know, it really, I have to say that the act of creating a forum where all voices are heard has to be totally inclusive, right? Anybody who's a victim of crime needs to be able to know that they are actually being heard. When I think about who is in charge of telling the stories, right, aside from media, I think courts are the forum where storytelling occurs, where people have permission to talk about the things that are hurtful and that are difficult. You know, when the Assemblyman was talking about what happened with domestic violence, well, you know, it didn't rise to the level of actual getting these cases prosecuted until people felt comfortable coming forward, that they wouldn't be criticized, that they wouldn't be re-victimized by a system of justice. And I think that's true, frankly, in the API community right now. There's a great deal of shame of reporting these crimes. It's very difficult for our community to come forward and say, yes, I've been the victim because of my language, my ethnicity, my race. And so all of us have a responsibility to try to create that culture and environment where people feel comfortable telling their story in a forum that allows people to be held accountable. You know, the LGBTQ community too is going through the same thing. It's okay to tell the story because that gives the rest of the system permission, right, to prosecute, to resolve this, to hold people accountable, and frankly, for society to say, this is not who we are. So when I even think about the role of judges, we're out in the community often speaking to different groups and to different people. And I think we have a responsibility to encourage people to report these crimes, to speak out loud these things that are happening that are very difficult for communities to name, especially in our community. It's just, there's still a great deal of shame of admitting that we've been victimized because of race or culture. And so it's very, very hard.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Maki, could I jump in for a second?
Yes.
And provide, it's a piggyback about, you asked about QR codes. I did actually want to give an example of that. The LAPD has developed in-language resource cards in Chinese, Korean, and Tagalog that we help them with, so they could hand that to Asian victims of hate. And what they have on it are resources to legal services, mental health services, and health services that are culturally responsive to that community. On those, they actually added QR codes. So that way you could either hand the victim that card or the person could just scan it and have it on that information on their phone. So I think QR codes sometimes can be used.
And Connie, also a follow-up to your prior statement about education and the importance of education, we have a quick question from our guest, Ms. Benfield. What do you think can be done to get to the core problem of hate? Should we look at how we raise and educate our children with compassion and value differences?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think for long-term prevention of violence and racism in our country, we definitely need to invest in Asian ethnic studies in the K through 12 level. So there was a PBS special on Asian Americans, and since then there's been a 50 lesson plan curriculum developed by actually my predecessor, Stuart Quo, called the Asian American Education Project. And that is available online, and they've trained, I think, 500 teachers already on how to use it. But if you don't recognize that this country has had a pattern and practice when we feel threatened by national security or by disease or other kinds of threats, of sometimes scapegoating Asian Americans. If you understand that history and know that, then we can do something about preventing it and being able to be aware to not do that again in the future. But right now, our children are not learning the history of the Chinese Exclusion Act, World War II, Japanese American internment, the killing of Vincent Chin, 9/11 South Asian and Muslim Islamophobia, and how this is a larger picture of a continuation of that scapegoating and that forever foreigner myth. And I think if we do that, both for Asian Americans as well as other ethnic studies, whether it's Latino studies, Black studies, and more, and incorporate that better into our curriculum, kids will have a heightened sensitivity themselves about racism in this country and what needs to be done to stop it.
Great, thank you so much. Back to you, Mr. Anderson.
Oh, my next question is actually for Justice Lieu. Do harsher penalties, as a judge and somebody who has a lot of experience at it, do you think harsher penalties and harsher sentences would lead to less hate crimes?
You know, Chris, that's a really tough question, because the simple answer or the overly simplistic answer is to say, of course. But we also know that that's not true. We know that enhanced penalties really don't always serve the purpose to deter crime or minimize it. It's an easy way to look at this. On the other hand, I have to say that an enhanced penalty on a hate crime sends a message that this is important to society, right? It says this is unacceptable and there will be an increase in punishment. So in some ways, it's a very complicated question that you just posed, because we have to ask ourselves, what is it that changes behavior? I'm not convinced that incarceration is the answer to do that. And yet, as a society, we also want to say that some behavior is simply unacceptable and will be condemned. Believe me, we're all wrestling with it and trying to figure it out.
Thank you very much. And moving on to Mr. Bannick and Ms. Manzo, I would like to know if what is the best way to deter hate crime offenses? Is it hard? Do you think it's through harsher penalties? Do you for first-time offenders, or maybe is it at the education level with diversion programming? What do you think?
Well, first, I think Justice, you really said that well, in that this is a really hard question to answer, because there's some hate crimes that are so horrific and awful that I think a harsher penalty is the right thing to do when we get them. But I think another part of this that I think people don't always know about is that for many of the lower level hate crimes that occur in our community, where someone is threatened or someone is assaulted in a minor way, at least in King County, many of these people suffer with mental illness. Many of the defendants, many of them suffer with drug and alcohol problems. And those people, obviously, sending them to jail for a longer amount of time is probably not going to affect their behavior. We have a couple of tools in King County to address some of these issues, and we're employing them, but we need more of these types of solutions. We have an alternative court called mental health court that is sometimes appropriate for the lower level, less serious types of hate crimes. We also have veterans court, which some of our people who commit hate crimes are veterans, and that has been a helpful place for, again, some of the lower level, less serious types of hate crimes. Another factor in Washington State that's very specific to Washington State is for hate crimes right now, we don't have community custody. It's not considered a crime against a person, which in Washington State is the type of crime where someone gets community custody, which is probation. Without that, someone who commits a hate crime basically only has incarceration as a punishment, which is both not helpful and also not really the right message to send when we're dealing with people that often need something in their life, some kind of accountability that maybe a probation officer can help provide. And so that's a change that we'd like to make in Washington State. We actually tried to in the last legislative session and it failed. But there's solutions like this that I think, of course, is not going to end hate crimes. We may even see the numbers continue to rise as we get more reporting. But I think if we employ some of these solutions, they can be handled in the right way, and we can hold people accountable with not just tons of jail time.
I'd just like to add, I think there can be a balance between sending a message to society that this is important, and not necessarily resolving cases with incarceration, not necessarily taking a narrow perspective. And it is very hard right now to explain to victims in Washington state that a hate crime is equivalent to possession of stolen vehicle, because that is still, as a prosecutor, very hard for me to wrap my mind around. And I think we can make this a crime against person, as DPA Bannick said, and also look at creative solutions that would reduce recidivism, as opposed to just harsh penalties that have proven to not be effective.
We all know that hate and violence is not something that can be boiled down to a simplistic answer. These are complex. And it is absolutely true that where the economy goes, when economies go south, we see rises in crimes in general, but also in hate crimes. In fact, the Chinese Exclusion Act and the anti-Chinese violence in the 19th century, historians will tell you, was very much a function of the lack of jobs and resentment at low-wage workers who were being pitted against other low-wage workers. And I think it's fair to say that we are certainly seeing incidents today where some of those tensions may be the case. And if the economy comes back, I think that will have an impact. But I think to try to boil it down so simplistically obviously misses some of the point. And one of the things maybe I'll just say as a closing remark, part of the reason I became an attorney, a prosecutor, civil rights attorney, and then ended up in the job that I have now is because of a hate crime that happened when I was in college against 8 Asian college students in a nearby school that wasn't investigated by the authorities. And that got me so, it fueled my activism as an 18-year-old to this very day. But the fact of the matter is, now a couple decades later, to some degree, I'm not sure how much things have changed for the better. I would have said over a year ago that maybe things have changed for the better, but clearly what we've seen this past year, this underbelly of darkness and racism has been very, very deep. And so I would say, long term, while we hope the economy will come back and we hope we put into place all the things we're talking about, we need to really dig deep and to get to these issues of education, just changing hearts and minds and where people are, particularly when they're young, getting them to think about this. Because that 17-year-old kid who may yell a racial slur to one of his classmates, we don't want to treat that in the criminal justice system. We want to figure out how to deal with that in a really deep way that ends this once and for all. That's the goal. That's why we're all here. So, I think I look forward to that work that we're going to do together with everyone on this panel and everyone who's listening to achieve that vision.